Chairman. Thanks for your patience. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Let me just start, if I could, with a question for Mr. Stimson and Mr. Jaffer. Either of you can answer this, but I want to go back to something I think Senator Grassley asked you about. I was just rereading this morning some of the Supreme Court's cases regarding Guantanamo Bay, back to the Boumediene case, which was the 2007 term, October term 2007, if memory serves. In that case in particular, the court noted that Guantanamo Bay has a unique status, jurisdictional status in American law. But the court also noted that when you move enemy alien combatants in this case, to American soil, to territory that is indisputably part of the sovereign territory of the United States, that the constitutional rights increase. And there's a long line of cases dealing with this. So can I just ask you for your view? I mean, one of the consequences of closing Guantanamo Bay and moving enemy combatants to the United States, and I realize that the Supreme Court has found, of course, that GITMO itself, the prisoners' presence in GITMO, does confer certain rights on them, particularly in the habeas context. But moving them to the United States, where you don't need to have a functional balancing test. It's not a sort of halfway U.S. territory, halfway not. If you moved into this country, what would the effect be on their constitutional rights, particularly if you involve them in traditional court proceedings in the criminal justice system, and that is not in the enemy combatant system? So maybe both of you can answer, but go ahead, Mr. Jaffer. We'll start with you.
Yeah, no, Senator Hawley, that's a great question. We don't know the exact answer. What we do know, I think, as you've correctly described, is that there's likely to be significantly more rights that the detainees would have if they were brought here, even under law of war detention, than being held at Guantanamo Bay, because Boumediene turned on the fact and the unique status of Guantanamo Bay, even in giving them that limited right to habeas. So it's highly likely that if the U.S. government were voluntarily to bring these individuals into the United States, even admitting them for limited purposes, paroling them in for the purposes of a trial or detention, they're going to get a certain number of rights that they wouldn't have otherwise had at Guantanamo Bay. And the question is then, what scope and how broad? Does the Fourth Amendment attach? Does the Fifth Amendment attach? How much of it? In what context? What about the right to confront witnesses? What about the evidence brought at trial? Remember, as Mr. Simpson correctly described, a lot of this evidence was gathered, to the extent there is evidence, on the battlefield. There's no chain of custody. There's not the usual things you would need in a federal trial, or even in a commission's trial or other alternate procedure that has some additional constitutional protections. And that's what's particularly problematic about bringing these detainees to the United States at this point in the ballgame.
Very good. Mr. Stimson?
The only thing I would add, Senator, is that you recall, since you've waded through the Boumediene decision, which was handed down in 2008, I recall, was the whole discussion by Justice Kennedy on de jure versus de facto jurisdiction. There's no doubt that once they're here in terra firma, that anyone will challenge all sorts of other aspects to their law of war detention, including probably bringing tort suits against people in their personal capacity. And so I don't think anyone wants to see those types of things happen. And so unless and until, for example, this body and the body across the Hill came together and passed legislation to cabin the rights that they would have if they were brought to the United States, and reaffirm the fact that they're in the law of war detention and that's the applicable law only, I think to Professor Jaffer's point, it's really an open question as to whether the rights would accrue to them.
So just to put a fine point on that, unless Congress acted, there would be, at the very least, an argument to be made that were detainees moved to United States soil, to what is indisputably the sovereign territory of the United States, we could be looking at all kinds of new legal rights and legal proceedings. Your point, Mr. Stimson, about tort suits that they could then bring, have the capacity to bring. I mean, we could be looking at a whole different set of legal rights and outcomes that are currently not even imaginable, considerable in GITMO. Let me ask you this. Professor Jaffer, you testified, I think, before the House Judiciary Committee subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, that other concerns with civilian trials included, and I'm quoting you here, this is from about 10 years ago, the physical security of civilians living in the area, the judges and staff working on those cases, and the jurors selected for trial. Is that something, those concerns, those security concerns, is that something that we should still be concerned about, in your view?
Absolutely. And it's not just my view. It was actually Majority Leader Schumer's view at the time that the Obama administration was interested in bringing some of the 9/11 plotters, including Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, to New York to try them. And it was an issue hotly discussed and debated in public. And ultimately, the Obama administration decided not to do that. But these concerns about the security of individuals, if the detainees are brought to the United States, not of the detainees themselves, they're well secured, but of those that support them and their supporters in the United States, could be hugely problematic. And remember, the biggest threat to the United States today from international terrorists is homegrown violent extremists who were inspired by Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Imagine if we brought their inspiration to the United States and tried them here. It could be hugely problematic.
Very good. Well, my time has expired. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. And